Hey guys, how's it going? Roger says hey. So this is another Patreon request actually for July. I'm a little bit behind on them, so I'm trying to kind of get them knocked out today, but I am looking forward to this one. This one was a request by Melkor, who is one of my most loyal viewers. He's been with me since basically the beginning of my channel. I enjoy having discussions with him either on Discord or on Patreon, so appreciate him suggesting this for me. This is going to be on Stalingrad. Now, I have not studied Stalingrad in depth, although I have touched on it in my World at War series that I'm doing on Patreon. If you guys are interested in watching that one, it's the documentary series from 1973. Doing all of the episodes over there on Patreon. But I also did a while back, towards the beginning of my channel, the Eastern Front videos on World War II by Eastery, and that was really my first look at the Eastern Front of this war, because prior to that, most of my time learning about World War II was spent mostly in the theater that America was involved in, which was the Western Front and also in the Pacific. So it was a very eye-opening for me learning more about the Eastern Front and just how many people died and just how brutal it was. Like, I just really was clueless about that. And I know that Stalingrad was like one of the worst parts about that. I think it was the German army got trapped in Stalingrad, the Russians surrounded them, and you know, a lot of civilians also died in Stalingrad because I think they laid siege to it and kind of kept a lot of supplies and food and stuff coming into the city, which meant that a lot of the civilians also, you know, suffered from that. I don't remember the exact stats of how many people died, but it was a lot. It was a lot. So I want to say like millions, but I feel like that's a little bit much. Maybe it's a few 100,000 that died. I'm sure they'll tell us in this video. This is not going to be my only in-depth look at it, because I feel like something on this epic of a scale deserves more than just a couple of short videos about it. So I am going to be looking into it more in the future as well, but this is going to be a nice little shorter introduction to Stalingrad itself. I also don't know if I've done a video from this channel, Animated History, before, but I've heard a lot about it. I've heard a lot of good things about it. And if you enjoy this video and my videos in general, I would appreciate it if you would like and subscribe. Anyway, let's go ahead and let's learn more about Stalingrad.
This video was made possible by our supporters on Patreon. If you want to join the community and help us reach our next goal, consider making a pledge. The average lifespan of a soldier in Stalingrad was just 24 hours. The battle for the city that bore Stalin's name was one of the longest and most arduous of the Second World War. It is for that reason that most historians regard the battle as a turning point in the war. I'm Griffin Johnson, the armchair historian, and today, in addition to telling you about the battle itself, I'll be providing personal accounts of both Russian and German soldiers in an effort to tell you the story of Stalingrad. But first, today's video is sponsored by Skillshare. I know, it's like we're official now. It's November 1941. The Wehrmacht is just miles away from the Russian capital, but is halted due to extreme weather conditions. The German infantry is plagued with frostbite, while the tanks are running short on fuel. Not that it matters because their engines won't even start. It's 4 below 0 Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, in Moscow, a secret meeting is taking place headed by Stalin himself, who refuses to leave the city and proclaims that Moscow will be defended to the last. At this meeting, the top Soviet military brass is gathered to discuss the Red Army's next course of action. Amid an atmosphere of panic and uncertainty, Semyon Timoshenko, the People's Commissar of Defense, takes the podium. Timoshenko boldly proclaims, "If Germany succeeds in taking Moscow, that is obviously a grave disappointment for us, but it by no means disrupts our grand strategy. Germany would gain accommodation from the harsh Russian winter, but that alone will not win the war. The only thing that matters is oil. So we have to do all we can to make Germany increase her oil consumption and to keep the German armies out of the Caucasus." Hitler acknowledged the scarcity of oil himself, reportedly saying, "To fight, we, the German people, must have oil for our machine."
You know what? Before I started watching all of these videos on World War II and World War I and all of that stuff, well, not really World War I, but World War II, I really had no clue how important oil was as a resource to all the enemies. It seems like a very basic thing, I guess, but I had always just really studied it more from the aspect of military strategies versus like trying to get access to your resources and stuff. But the more I'm watching, the more and more I'm realizing how much of war is about just resources as it is, you know, about like military strategy and gaining ground and and all of that stuff. You know, a lot of times you want to gain ground in order to get those resources. So it's just a new aspect of war I had never really considered before, is, you know, like getting access to iron ores and oil and that stuff so that you can continue to feed your equipment, build things. It seems weird now that I didn't really know much about that prior to this, but it's been really cool, like being enlightened, I guess, on that.
To fight, we, the German people, must have oil for our machine. Thus, the decision was made by Hitler and his senior staff to divert the German army group south to secure both the Volga and the Caucasus. The plan would be called Case Blue and was meant to be a second blitzkrieg to break the stalemate of the Eastern Front. It called for the assembly.
I remember from the Eastern Front videos I did, you guys let me know, because I didn't understand why Hitler was so adamant about protecting the Caucasus, or why they were fighting in that area. And a lot of you guys let me know that that's where a lot of the oil fields are. So I understand that now. That's good.
Be a second blitzkrieg to break the stalemate of the Eastern Front. It called for the assembling of 1.3 million men and 1,500 aircraft. The men that made up Army Group South were split into two detachments. Army Group A, which would swing around the city of Stalingrad and secure the oil field of Baku, and then converge onto Stalingrad from the south, while Army Group B, which was made up of the German 6th Army, 4th Panzer Army, and Romanian and Italian allies, would march directly towards Stalingrad, the major Soviet industrial city. The Soviets had other plans. The oil fields of Nikop and Elista, which were on the way to Baku, were both set aflame by the Red Army. Grozny, meanwhile, also en route to Baku, was destroyed by the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe, instead of being captured due to the fierce Russian resistance and strained German supply lines. This would mean that Army Group B would be taking on Stalingrad alone and face severe logistical problems. Hitler's oil crisis persisted, but the battle for Stalingrad was only just beginning. The German Army Group B, spearheaded by the 6th Army under General Paulus, met resistance from the Soviets near the Don River. It took nearly a month for the 6th Army to assert control over the area that lay west of Stalingrad. The campaign was already shaping up to be slightly more costly for the Germans than expected. However, morale among the troops remained high as they waited for a victory and dreamt of either returning home or settling in Russian lands after the war ended. Wilhelm Hoffmann, a soldier at the time of the battle, wrote in his diary the following: "What great spaces the Soviets occupy, what rich fields there are to be had here after the war is over. Only let's get it over with quickly. I believe that the Fuhrer will carry the thing through to a successful end." If you haven't already, I suggest taking a look at my video, which goes through the majority of Wilhelm's diary in Stalingrad. With the German advance delayed, Soviet military officials in Stalingrad, headed by Choikov, had time to prepare for the desperate onslaught that was materializing. As Catherine Marendale relates it in her book, citizens were pressed into military gangs and given shovels, carts, and lumps of wood. Tank traps and trenches were prepared, defensive drills rehearsed, but none of these preparations would prevent the cataclysm when it came. Citizens of Stalingrad would be forced to stay and face the battle ahead. There would be no retreat. The first direct attack on Stalingrad began on August 23rd. 600 planes of the Luftwaffe flew over the city and relentlessly carpet-bombed its inhabitants. The German planes left decimation in their wake. 40,000 Russians, mainly civilians, were killed, and much of the city was reduced to rubble. Max Hastings, in his book, describes the aftermath with haunting detail. The street is no longer measured by meters, but by corpses. Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day, it is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. It is a vast furnace lit by the reflection of the flames, and when night arrives, one of those scorching, howling, bleeding nights, the dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to gain the other bank. The nights of Stalingrad are a terror for them. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure. The Soviet forces took up positions in the central and northern parts of Stalingrad. As the German 6th Army encircled
This animation is depicting Stalingrad as it looks more like a small town or village rather than a city. Is that how? And it looks like rural almost. Is that just this drawing being overly simplistic, or was it really like this? I was expecting more of like you said, an industrial city. I was expecting, concrete and a lot of buildings and stuff, but this, I don't know, maybe it's just the animation style, which I like, by the way. I'm really liking the looks of this and how he's doing it.
Took up positions in the central and northern parts of Stalingrad. As the German 6th Army encircled the city, a Russian soldier named Anton Dragon documented what life was like for him as a lieutenant of the Red Army. The Germans had cut us off from our neighbors, the supply of ammunition had been cut off, every bullet was worth its weight in gold. Every inch of the city was disputed as the Germans were forced to make their way through the city house by house, stairwell by stairwell. The Russians were told to practically hug the German advance to render German aircraft and artillery support useless. The Luftwaffe maintained air superiority and continued carpet bombing, killing Russians and Germans alike, and preventing boats from bringing shipments of supplies and men to alleviate the defenders. It is in the midst of this scene of chaos that we return to Dragon, who describes the dire state of the Soviets' position. As our numbers grew smaller, we shortened our lines of defense. We began to move back slowly towards the Volga, drawing the enemy after us, and the ground we occupied was invariably too small for the Germans to be able to easily use artillery and aircraft. During this retreat to the inner city, the Soviets were aided by artillery that was tactically positioned on the Volga's eastern bank. The feeling of growing frustration on the German side is aptly captured by Hoffmann's entry on the 22nd of September 1942. Our soldiers have never experienced such bitter fighting before. And on the Soviet side, Choikov, the commander of the 62nd Army, who maintained rigid discipline, shed light on a more desperate state of affairs. The heavy casualties, the constant retreat, the shortage of food and munitions, the difficulty of receiving reinforcements made many long to get across the Volga to escape the hell of Stalingrad. Choikov writes on another occasion, "Everyone saw a man in flames leap out of the trench, run right up to the German tank, and smash the bottle against the grill of the engine hatch. A second later, an enormous sheet of flame and smoke engulfed both the tank and the hero who had destroyed it." Acts like this prompted the Germans to express disbelief, even in the air. A Luftwaffe pilot who had rained fire from the skies said, "I cannot understand how men survive such a hell, yet the Russians sit tight in the ruins and holes and cellars and a chaos of steel skeletons which used to be factories." As the infamous Russian winter set in, the tide of battle had turned. The Russians put Operation Uranus into action, planned by Chief of General Staff Georgy Zhukov and executed by a Polish-Soviet officer, Konstantin Rokossovsky. Their goal was to encircle the 6th Army and relieve Stalingrad's determined defenders. The operation began on November 19, 1942, and involved more than 1 million Red Army soldiers. Only 3 days after the operation had begun, the 6th Army was completely encircled and trapped in the city that they had besieged. Hitler did not consider retreat an option and gave orders for the Germans to hold their ground.
For a few minutes here, I was thinking that I had it wrong in my intro when I said that the Germans got trapped and surrounded in Stalingrad. I thought I was wrong for a minute, and it was really the Russians that had gotten. But this is kind of proving me right here. Okay, so good. I didn't get that wrong.
The Soviets also gained air superiority by producing large amounts of aircraft and positioning anti-aircraft guns that prevented the Luftwaffe from being able to airdrop supplies and evacuate men. One of the more notable Soviet aircraft was the IL-2, a ground attacker which would pick up the nickname of the Flying Tank. If you're interested in learning more about this aircraft, check out the video by my friend Tiberiu over on the YouTube channel Wartime History. This put an end to any hope of Axis victory. Now it was only a matter of time before the Soviets overwhelmed the German forces. Under General Paulus, the 6th Army and their allies held out until January before finally giving in. Although Paulus did not agree with Hitler's orders and considered defying them, he did not attempt a breakout, largely due to a fear of leaving other elements of the Wehrmacht in the clutches of the Red Army. When the Soviets finally overran the Germans and drove them out of their dugouts, it seemed to some that the battle had been the same nightmare for everyone. However, Soviet troops had always had lower expectations. They were not dreaming of their Christmas trees or of the sweets and cakes that they had never known. If they had thought about home, it was about the life that their enemy had destroyed. Although many historians attribute the German failure at Stalingrad solely to poor logistics and planning, the Soviets' unwavering defense of the city was also a crucial factor in determining the outcome of the battle, which would shape the rest of the war. In accordance to Order Number 2, factor in
incredible stat right there of 110,000 German soldiers taken prisoner at Stalingrad. Only about 5,000 made it back home after the war. So taken prisoner. So I guess that shows exactly how the Soviets treated their prisoners. Goodness.
In determining the outcome of the battle, which would shape the rest of the war. In accordance to Order Number 227, made famous for its line, "Not one step back, the Red Army had withstood the German onslaught." From that point on, the Soviets would remain on a near constant offensive, pushing the Germans back to Berlin by 1945.
Alright, well, you know, that was really cool. I liked the graphics in this. The way that he presented things was pretty cool. Was a little surprised about how he showed Stalingrad, although, like, when he showed the pictures actually in Stalingrad, it looks a little bit more like what I expected, more of like a concrete, you know, city type thing rather than, you know, more of a rural, you know, town or whatever. But I don't know, like I haven't really, I don't think I've seen too many pictures of Stalingrad to really know. I liked how he showed kind of the positions of all of the soldiers and how it kind of played out. It helps me get a better understanding of exactly what was going on. And also like how he talked a little bit more about behind the scenes of the strategy that the generals and the commanders were you know, coming up with and trying to implement. Of course, I would like to see more on Stalingrad because I feel like this just barely scratched the surface. You know, I'm sure that there are plenty of documentaries out there that show more of, you know, what life was actually like in there for, what was it, like August through February or something? So a good 6 months at least, or 7 months, whatever it is, that these people had to endure all of this stuff. I mean, I can only imagine. You know, the soldiers had it bad, but think about the civilians. And I think, wasn't it Stalin that trapped the people in Stalingrad? They weren't allowed to escape because I think it was that he thought that the Russian soldiers would fight more or harder if he left everybody there or something. I don't know if that's true or not. That's just what I've heard in other things before. But yeah, it's interesting because, you know, I'm learning more about like these turning points in the war, about how Stalingrad, a lot of people say Stalingrad was the turning point, you know, in the war. And I know it's kind of pointless to try and point to one turning point because there are multiple things that happen in wars that, you know, ultimately lead to the demise of, you know, one side or the other. I do think that Stalingrad was definitely the turning point, I guess, of the Eastern Front, like D-Day was kind of the turning point of the Western Front. What I just learned last night in my World at War series I'm doing on Patreon, that the Battle of Midway was kind of like the turning point in the Pacific Theater over there. So it's interesting how just like these one battles on these I would say days, like D-Day was basically one day, Stalingrad lasted months, you know. It's amazing how just like one battle basically can determine the outcome, you know, of years long worth of conflict. So it's just interesting. It's just interesting to learn about. So thanks again, Melkor, for suggesting this video. It was fun to learn some new stuff about Stalingrad and kind of the Eastern Front and what was going on. If you guys want to suggest any other videos on Stalingrad for me so I can learn a little bit more about it, please leave those down in the comments for me. Again, you'll find the links to my social media, Discord, Patreon, all of that in the description and in my pinned comment if you're interested in any of those things. Roger here, and I thank you guys for watching. As always, stay tuned for more World War II military type videos coming up, and we'll see you next time.